All right, today is Vision Sunday, and next week we're actually going to be revisiting our sermon series in the book of Colossians. And the message or the passage that was just read for you by Sarah is this passage from the book of Ephesians, which is written by the Apostle Paul, who is writing to one of the early churches in Ephesus. Now, when this pandemic first started in March, and Sarah mentioned, of course, we are now at the 6-month mark of this. Of course, it was a brutal time. And what was interesting, what was happening across our family of churches, the outer borough churches, there was a lot of sickness and death. People that we knew that were part of our original team were getting sick and were passing away. Meanwhile, of course, the economic ramifications of what happened that reverberated around our city and around the world. And meanwhile, in Manhattan, our Midtown church, we just had a number of people that were losing jobs, some that were getting sick, and many that ended up leaving the city. And if you recall, in March and April were just awful. And the death toll here in New York was incredibly high in mid-April, right around Easter. And then it started to descend a bit. And then, of course, in May, people just started to leave the city. Now, of course, they left before that. And I remember, I was in this season of just real grief and sadness. And so there's actually a group of mentors and pastors and friends from around the country that I send updates to around the country, just usual updates about what's happening and what people could be praying for our family, for our church, for our city. And so I sent an email that was basically a note saying, I'm not doing so well. And it's been a really difficult season. And one of the hardest things is the volume. Now, of course, in New York, we're used to saying goodbye to a lot of folks, but the volume of people that we were saying goodbye to, and it felt like the city was becoming just a shell of what it was pre-COVID. And so I sent this note out to these friends that I send emails to regularly. And different people sent back messages. One such person who sent back a message was Pastor Tim Keller, who's been a pastor here in the city for a long time. And he was sympathizing with the feeling of desolation that I was going through, along with so many others. And in a weird way, as difficult and as dark as that season was, I was actually fairly encouraged by the message that he sent, because he was affirming how bad it was. And yet at the same time, he helped to reframe things. And this is what he wrote to me. He wrote, prosperity, growth, and optimism in the city offers a set of real advantages and real disadvantages to church ministry and church planting. But outmigration, economic trouble, and discouragement in a city offers a very different but equal set of advantages and disadvantages. It would be good to think those out, he wrote to me. I planted Redeemer during a big recession in 1991 and high crime time in which people were leaving the city. Now, of course, in the 80s in New York City, it was the murder capital of the States. There were over, I believe, 2,500 murders a year. Just to give a sense of where we are today, murder has increased in the city, and there were 147 murders over the past 6 months. But to give some context of when Tim planted Redeemer, again, 2,500 murders a year in the city. So it was incredibly higher back then. And again, this is not to say, hey, it's not that bad right now, because things are really bad. But by the late 1990s, the city was in go-go prosperity and growth. And I don't think that it made it easier to do evangelism, ironically. Probably it was harder. Then there was 9/11 in 2008 recession. In general, the main disadvantages of the hard times is financial, plus a sad loss of some key leaders. And then he wrote, but the advantages were many. In general, people were more in need, spiritual, emotional, etc. And I found people more appreciative of supportive community and ministry. And two, while hard times means fewer people from the USA migrate to New York City, the young professionals and families, there are always some people who will take their place, like immigrants from other countries. Now, and then he went on to write, I just want you to know I'm praying for you, I'm for you, and et cetera, et cetera. And in a weird way, I was oddly really encouraged by what Tim had to write, because I was really sad. And I felt like, man, we are in this season where it feels like the city is a shell of itself. And folks from our church and key leaders, like you mentioned, were leaving. And there was a real grief and sadness that I was carrying. And it kind of reminded me of 9/11 when I was, those of you who were here during 9/11, of course, it was such a difficult time in our city. And I recall all of the anxieties around whether or not New York City would ever recover from such a catastrophic event as 9/11. There was the belief that no one would want to come back to buildings, and that Lower Manhattan would become just a desolate wasteland. And people were leaving the city, and it was a really difficult time in the city. Now, for those of us, though, who can look back on that time of 9/11 and what happened, and as hard and as difficult as that season was, kind of the fruit that has been born out of difficult circumstances and the way that the city bounced back after 9/11. And the list goes on, right? The 2008 recession, Hurricane Sandy, and the ways that the city has continued to bounce back. Now, of course, COVID has felt very different in that we haven't had a chance to really be together and grieve together. And as a result, there's been this very confusing, discombobulating season that I feel as a pastor in this church and in the city right now. And but it's just reminded me in this moment that what are the moments, the glimmers of hope that we've experienced. And it brought to mind, actually, there was a British anthropologist from the mid-1900s who was basically, he would do research on rite of passage. And what he studied, this guy named Victor Turner, who's a British anthropologist, he actually studied these communities in Africa that would have these rite of passages for young boys. And of course, this is how these tribal kind of communities functioned. There were the women and the children that were together in one kind of subset. And then there were the men who were the hunters and the gatherers. And what would happen is there would be a rite of passage moment that would mark the moment where these young boys would kind of leave this group of women and children and would be go through this rite of passage to join this group of men. And what he studied in this was that there was this middle kind of moment where these young boys would be on this rite of passage. And so they would all be invited to this thing. And the men would gather, let's say, around a fire. Now, again, I'm kind of ad-libbing about what he describes, but the men would gather around a fire and gather these young boys and be telling them, hey, now's the time where you're going to pass through this moment where you go from being young boys to becoming men. And so they would gather around and they'd be around a fire. And then they would be commissioned to go out into the wilderness, into the wild. These young boys who had been domesticated for so long, they would be called now to be on their own in this new community, to go out into the wilderness on their own. And then the men would actually leave these boys. And so the boys would be out on this expedition on their own, surviving on their own. Now, Victor Turner, he comes up with this phrase, and the phrase that he uses for these young boys who are in this time that's discombobulating, that's difficult, that feels like we're not sure if we're going to make it to the other side. He calls this liminality, liminal space, this moment where I don't know what's next. I don't know what's coming. And it feels incredibly difficult. Now, during that season, the boys would have a hard time. They would have to depend on one another. They would have to lean on one another. They would have to go out and do things that they had never been challenged or pushed to do before. Now, what would happen is these boys would end up surviving this after however long this rite of passage took. And these boys were then invited back. So they had just, if you can imagine, these boys would go through this trying, harrowing experience, but they would live to see the other side. They would get through liminality. And then they would gather around a fire again with the men. And the men would ask these boys these questions about what was it like? Tell me stories about what happened. And of course, these boys would be telling stories about how difficult it was and how hungry they were, how cold they were, how they would be making fun of each other. They would be like, oh my goodness, do you remember when Ted, he ran up the tree because he saw that animal or he heard that rustling sound or whatever? And then, Ted would say, whatever, man. How about that one time when you were crying because you missed your mom and da-da-da-da-da, right? And so there were these moments. And they would gather around this fire and they would tell these stories. And these stories were the evidence of how something had changed. Something had moved this new group of people, this new group of boys, into a new journey, a brand new journey. And Victor Turner calls this new community that's formed. He calls it communitas, a different kind of community, a community that's been forged through the fire, that's gone through the most hellish times and made it to the other side. communitas. And how sometimes the only way that we can grow to make it to the other side is when we've been forged through the fire. You know what's so amazing is that in the early church, of course, Christianity was this nothing religion, a bunch of no-name, ordinary people it talks about in the book of Acts, against the backdrop of the Roman Empire with all of its might and strength and power. And there was this small group, this band of Christians who no one knew about, that worshiped a Jewish carpenter who claimed that this Jewish carpenter was Lord and was God. And what's so startling and amazing is that the story of the Christian faith is the story of beginnings, of this humble beginnings, of this group of people who band together against all odds. And then you have the Apostle Paul, who is writing to the church in Ephesus, again, to this small group. And this is what he writes: "For this reason, I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name. I pray that out of his glorious riches, he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all of the fullness of God." Now, he's writing this in Ephesians 3, and he says, "For this reason." For what reason? Because the first 3 chapters of the book of Ephesians was basically about how God, in his great mercy and his grace, is for us, so that whatever circumstance we might find ourselves in, we've got this sturdy resurrection faith that can lead us and guide us in any liminal circumstance. And this is why he says, "For this reason, this is what I want for you. I pray that all of these things may be true of you." And look at what Paul writes. If we can go to the next slide. He says this. He says, "Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more." In fact, while you're muted, why don't we all say that together? Immeasurably more than all we can ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. To him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus through all generations, forever and ever. Amen. Oh, like Paul is writing this to a group of, this small bandit, like it's a small band of Christians who are nothing. And he says, oh, you see the resurrection God who is on our side. He helps us to pass through these liminal spaces. And he, even in moments of trial and difficulty, can do immeasurably more. And that's the invitation for us. For those of us who have remained in the city and who are here, what if the story that God is writing, what if it's a story where God will do immeasurably more than all we can ask or imagine? Where we'll be able to look back at this time and be like, man, it seemed like the city was in shambles. But man, God has done immeasurably more. He's done immeasurably more through the generosity that you and I have shown to those in need. He's done immeasurably more in forging a deeper dependence and bond, a communitas amongst us, where we'll be able to tell these stories one day to our kids and to generations, and to tell them, you know what, even when it felt like things were so bleak and it felt like the city was in shambles, God did immeasurably more. He led us even when it was hard. Oh, and do you remember these relationships that came out of it? These people who fell in love out of this. I don't know if that's going to be you, but maybe you can show up and you're single and you meet some other single people at our church. The COVID babies that have come out. I'm just thinking of all sorts of whatever might be the immeasurably more might be. The moments when we look back and we say, wow, God has done immeasurably more. One of the mantras, when we first started this church in 2012, kind of one of the mantras, and then Hope Midtown started in 2014, the mantras that we used was, what we want to be, what we want to be about. We want to be about the gospel story. And kind of the way that we translated a gospel story was this phrase: we want to be about a damn good story. that each of us would live lives in such a manner that we believed that greater than the stories perhaps that the media tells, greater than the story of demise, that the world might look at the church, that we are telling a damn good story of how God takes beauty from ashes, how he raises the dead, how he rebuilds his church, even in the midst of incredibly trying circumstances. What if we could be part of a damn good story? And what if that damn good story was not because of how gifted or how wonderful or how talented you and I are, but it's because we believe in the Spirit of the living God who raises the dead, who fills his people with a supernatural love, who calls us to be a countercultural people in the midst of the city, to be a people of great generosity, to be a people of great holiness, to be a great people of kindness and justice in the world around us. What if we could be a damn good people kind of people, a kind of story? And that's the invitation for us in this next season.